At 8:47 on a Tuesday morning in September, the most expensive silence in the history of Voss Capital Group was the one happening in the backseat of a black Mercedes S-Class on the Bayshore Freeway. CEO Adriana Voss was on her 11th phone call in 40 minutes, her voice climbing with each redial, her knuckles pale around a phone that kept delivering the same answer, dressed in different voices. Her $1.2 billion merger with the Nakamura-Obi Prasad consortium was collapsing in real time. And the reason it was collapsing was the one reason no one had thought to plan for. Every certified interpreter she had access to had vanished overnight. 3 agencies, 7 individual contacts, 4 personal favors called in across the Bay Area international business community. Not one of them could help her, not today, not in time. Her partners from Tokyo, Lagos, and Mumbai had landed at San Francisco International Airport 45 minutes ago. They were currently in the Centurion Lounge. They had a meeting in 3 hours. Without communication bridges across 3 language and cultural systems that had nothing in common except a deal that still wasn't signed, that meeting would last 9 minutes and end with handshakes that meant goodbye rather than hello. 3 years of negotiation, 22 international flights, 147 hours of call time. Going to zero because no one had built a backup plan around the assumption that interpreters could disappear. In the front seat, on the other side of the partition's tinted glass, Solomon James watched all of this in the rearview mirror and said nothing. He had been Adriana Voss's driver for 2 years and 9 months. In that time, she had spoken his name perhaps 8 times, 4 of which were to confirm she'd arrived at the correct address. She did not know that he held a master's degree in applied linguistics from Georgetown University. She did not know that he had spent 7 years at the State Department as a diplomatic interpreter and cultural mediation specialist at the bureau level. She did not know that he spoke Mandarin, Japanese, Yoruba, Hindi, French, Arabic, and English with fluency that ranged from functional to native. That his reading in 3 of those languages was faster than his reading in English, or that the notebook sitting in his glove compartment contained 2 years and 9 months of professional observations about the deal she was currently watching die. She didn't know any of this because she had never asked, and Solomon had not told her, not because he was waiting for a dramatic moment, but because the invitation to speak had never materialized in a form he could honestly interpret as genuine. This is a story about what it costs to assume you already know who someone is, about the expertise that evaporates from institutional view the moment it arrives in a package that doesn't match the template of what expertise is supposed to look like. About a man who listened to the same conversations for 1,000 days, heard every mistake, understood every consequence, and waited with a patience that was not resignation but principle, until the morning when everything fell apart at once, and the only question left was whether the person who needed him could extend enough trust to let him help. And it begins not in a boardroom or a terminal lounge, but in a kitchen in Detroit, when Solomon James was 9 years old, watching his father sit at the table after dinner translating a letter from a Haitian family who needed help navigating a government form, doing it for free, doing it because someone had asked. Solomon Elias James was born in 1981 in Detroit, Michigan, the second child of 2 people whose lives had been shaped by the conviction that language was not an asset, but a responsibility. His father, Ezekiel James, worked for 31 years as a senior interpreter for the State Department. His mother, Ruth, taught English as a second language at the Detroit Public Library for 24 years. A job that paid poorly and mattered enormously, and that she talked about with a love that made Solomon understand early that the work worth doing was rarely the work that paid what it deserved. Ezekiel James was a man of structured devotion. He believed that if you could speak someone's language, you owed them the precision of your best effort. He had watched negotiations fail, not because of disagreement, but because of translation that was technically correct and culturally catastrophic, words that landed right and meaning that landed wrong. And he had understood that the gap between those two things was the gap where trust either formed or failed. He taught this to Solomon not as career advice, but as a way of being in the world. When you can hear someone, you hear them completely. You hear what they're saying, what they mean, what they're afraid to say, and what the silence between their words is carrying. That is the whole job. Nothing less counts. Solomon absorbed this curriculum across childhood and adolescence. He spoke 3 languages before high school, 5 before college, and 7 by the time he graduated from Georgetown in 2004, with a master's degree in applied linguistics and a fellowship that placed him directly into the State Department's Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs. He was 23 years old and already understood that fluency was the beginning of the skill, not the skill itself. What he was learning to do at the bureau level was something far more complex: cultural interpretation. The ability to not just translate what was said, but to represent what was meant, to account for register, hierarchy, implied obligation, relational context, and the 1,000 invisible rules that govern how meaning moved between people who came from entirely different frameworks of communication. He was exceptionally good at it. His supervisors noted his instincts in their evaluations with a language that was unusual in government paperwork, words like rare and irreplaceable. He was trusted with sensitive negotiations involving billion-dollar aid agreements. He sat in rooms where what came out of his mouth determined whether alliances held or fractured. He did this for 7 years. And then in 2011, an internal audit of a failed trade agreement named his division in terms that were not criminal, but were institutional, the kind of language in government reports that doesn't charge anyone with anything, but that quietly closes doors in ways that have nothing to do with personal culpability and everything to do with proximity and optics. His clearances were reviewed. Certain assignments became unavailable. The network of institutional trust that had been his professional infrastructure underwent a recalibration that was never hostile and never explained and never quite complete enough to recover from. He was 30 years old with a skill set that was genuinely extraordinary and a resume that now carried a gap where the most distinguished section had been. He applied to positions at international firms, at major consulting companies, at corporations that had stated needs for exactly his profile. Interviews went well until they reached the section where the gap required explanation. And the explanation, which was honest and accurate and exonerating, was also complicated. Complicated explanations made traditional employers nervous in a specific way that polite rejection letters never quite named. Doors close quietly, professionally, permanently. The way institutional doors close when they have already decided and are simply completing the courtesy of a process. He consulted. He translated legal documents for immigration firms. He helped families navigate asylum applications in languages their attorneys couldn't read. He did this work with the same precision his father had brought to the kitchen table translations of his childhood, and he charged what the market would bear, which was not much, and he stretched every dollar across. Rent and groceries and the $400 he sent to his mother every month since his father had passed. In 2016, and Ruth James's income had become a fixed thing that didn't accommodate surprise. The driving job arrived through a professional services agency in 2021. The posting specified multilingual candidates preferred, corporate executive transport, discretion required. Solomon had applied as a temporary measure and had stayed because the stability it provided was real, because the translation consulting work was supplemental, not sufficient, and because something about the front seat of that car had given him something he hadn't expected: time, quiet, proximity to a level of corporate decision-making that he understood from the inside, from his State Department years, and that he now watched from the outside with the particular clarity of someone who no longer needed to perform in the room to understand exactly what was happening in it. He had a notebook in the glove compartment, not a diary, a professional record. Every significant call he'd overheard, every cultural mistake he'd observed, every pattern he'd identified, not to expose anyone, not to build a case, because he was Solomon James, and Solomon James did not stop thinking at the level he'd been trained to think at just because the institution around him had changed. 2 years and 9 months of observations about the Nakamura-Obi Prasad negotiation sat in that notebook, organized by date, partner, issue type, and his own assessment of what had been damaged and what could still be repaired. He also had a second set of obligations pressing on him that morning with urgency entirely separate from the one playing out in the back seat. Mrs. Okonkwo's asylum appeal documentation was due at the federal court in Oakland in 49 hours. He had been working on it for 3 weeks. It was a complex case, politically sensitive, involving testimony against individuals who remained dangerous, requiring translation from 2 Nigerian dialects with legal precision that couldn't be approximated. He was 85% through it. The remaining 15% was the hardest. He had needed tonight and tomorrow to finish it properly. Tonight and tomorrow were now uncertain. He thought about Mrs. Okonkwo's daughters, who were 7 and 10 years old and who had drawn him a picture of a house with a garden and written across the top in careful English, "Our home when we stay." He kept it in the same glove compartment as the notebook, folded, carefully, slightly worn at the creases from being unfolded and refolded enough times to mean something. His checking account held $912. Rent was due in 13 days, his mother's next payment in 11. The agency contract that provided the driving income could theoretically be terminated by either party with 2 weeks' notice, which meant that whatever he was about to do in the next 10 minutes would carry consequences that touched every single thing at once. He watched Adriana's 11th call end in silence. He watched her press both palms flat on the seat and stare at the dashboard with the expression of someone calculating whether there is any mathematics left that produces a favorable outcome. There wasn't. He could see that from the front seat. She couldn't see it because she was still inside the problem, still cycling through the familiar tools that had always worked before, still not yet arrived at the awareness that the solution was not a variation of what she'd already tried. Solomon lowered the partition. The question he asked was simple. He asked what languages the partners needed. Adriana turned from the window with an expression he recognized from 2 years and 9 months of the rear-view mirror. The micro-recalibration that happens when furniture unexpectedly speaks. Confusion, brief territorial irritation, and then the thing that made the difference between her and people who would have simply dismissed him: necessity overriding habit. She answered, "Tokyo required Japanese." Lagos required Yoruba and fluent English. Mumbai required Hindi. And she needed someone who understood not just the words, but the cultural architecture of all three. Because the problem wasn't translation, it was that she had been damaging relationships she needed intact and hadn't known it was happening. Solomon told her he spoke all three languages she'd named. He told her about Georgetown, about the bureau years, about cultural mediation at the diplomatic level. He told her the language problem was secondary. He told her that what she had been doing on her calls to the Tokyo partners, defaulting to a direct Western negotiating register when Japanese high-value partnership communication required patience and indirection, had been readable as contempt by people who communicated respect through process. He told her that her Hindi, technically correct and culturally flat, had been signaling to the Mumbai group that the relationship was transactional to her in a context where relationship was the entire container. The transaction lived inside. He told her that the Lagos team had been operating in a communication framework she hadn't been meeting, and that what read as enthusiasm from her had been landing as impatience with their timeline. He told her he could fix this if she would let him, not theoretically, specifically. In the next 3 hours, if they move now. Adriana Voss stared at him for what felt like considerably longer than the 7 seconds it actually was. Then she said 3 words, "Get in there." What followed was not simple. Buildings that gate access to billion-dollar negotiations are not built to accommodate last-minute credential reassessments. And the people inside those buildings who manage access are not architecturally prepared for the category of situation that has just presented itself. Solomon encountered resistance at every layer, and the resistance was professional and institutional, and also something else, the specific friction that appears when someone's presence in a room doesn't match the institutional template of who belongs in that room, a friction that has a long history and a consistent texture, and that Solomon recognized immediately because he had been navigating it in various forms his entire adult life. The COO, Richard Bale, met them in the corridor with the expression of a man who has already decided and is now performing the courtesy of appearing to consider. He asked questions designed to expose insufficiency rather than establish competence. He cited protocols and timelines and security concerns that were legitimate in isolation and were being deployed collectively as a wall. He spoke to Solomon with a tone that was technically respectful and substantively dismissive, the specific combination that is most difficult to name because its surface is always clean. Adriana pushed back with the focused energy of someone who has spent 3 years building toward a singular outcome and is now watching the last variable that could save it being processed through bureaucratic machinery that moves far slower than the 4 hours remaining. She was direct, she was forceful, and she was also, Solomon noted with the observational habit of 2.5 years, running out of leverage inside a building where her own people were the obstacle. Solomon sat in a waiting area chair and opened his laptop. He was not idle. He had been thinking, since the moment he'd lowered the partition, about a second set of facts that he had not yet introduced into the conversation, facts that were not about his qualifications, but about why the interpreter network had collapsed in the first place, because he had a theory about that. And the theory had been forming for 6 weeks, since the Saturday morning when he'd done his weekly detail of the Mercedes and found, behind the rear seat's center headrest, a small cellular transmitter the size of a matchbook, broadcasting continuously to an external receiver. Solomon had found it during a routine sweep. He ran because Ezekiel James had raised the sun, who understood that information moved in directions people assumed were private and that verification was not paranoia but professionalism. He had logged the transmitter's serial number, photographed it from 4 angles, left it in place, and said nothing. Because he had learned in the front seat and before the front seat that information has a moment, and the moment for that particular piece of information had not yet arrived. It arrived now in the waiting area, while Richard Bale was in the conference room explaining to Adriana why bringing an unvetted contractor into a billion-dollar negotiation was inadvisable. Solomon traced the transmitter's purchase records through public commercial databases. Shell, company, 3 layers of corporate registration. The trail surfaced at a private investment vehicle registered to one Conrad Voss, Adriana's paternal uncle, minority board member, and the person who had the most to gain from the Nakamura-Obi Prasad deal collapsing. Conrad had been advocating internally for a different acquisition path, a domestic consolidation that would have preserved his influence over the company's strategic direction. The Asia-Pacific merger diluted his position in ways the domestic deal would not. Solomon looked at this information in the waiting area of a building he had not been authorized to enter and thought about what it meant and where it led. Then he ran the second thread. The Mumbai security breach, which the Mumbai Partner Group had cited as the reason they were now questioning the integrity of the entire negotiation, had flagged an IP address registered to Voss Capital Group's internal network. The breach was being treated as evidence that Voss Capital had been accessing proprietary Mumbai consortium files covertly, which would make them not a trustworthy partner, but an active threat. Solomon accessed Voss Capital's public-facing IT architecture. He mapped the flagged IP against the company's cloud service provider transparency logs, which were public record under securities compliance regulations. The server the IP was registered to had been provisioned 3 weeks ago, not years ago, with the rest of the corporate infrastructure. It had been created specifically. He cross-referenced the provisioning timestamp 2:47 a.m. on a Wednesday with the building security access logs, also public record for a publicly traded company. 3 people had badged into Voss Capital's facilities between 2 and 3 a.m. that night. 2 had entered the main building. 1, Conrad Voss, had badged into the auxiliary technology infrastructure building across the street. He mapped the data flows from the reported breach. The Mumbai Consortium servers had registered a transfer of 4.3 gigabytes at 6:22 a.m. on the morning of the deal's final preparation phase. But Solomon could see in the public network architecture that the data had never left Voss Capital's internal routing. It had been pulled, staged on the rogue server Conrad had provisioned, and immediately deleted. The transfer existed in the breach logs but nowhere else, creating the evidence of theft without the substance of it. It was a staged incident, technically proficient, designed to be discoverable by a paranoid IT team running standard post-incident analysis, while being sophisticated enough that the staging wouldn't be obvious to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. Solomon compiled everything. Every piece of evidence was drawn entirely from public records, commercial databases, and regulatory filings. Nothing required privileged access. Nothing required taking his word for anything. The evidence either verified independently or it didn't, and he was confident it would, because Conrad Voss had built his scheme to be invisible to casual examination, not to the forensic attention of a man with 7 years of State Department experience in exactly this category of analytical problem. He organized the documentation into a single comprehensive file, structured the way he'd been taught to structure diplomatic briefing materials. Clear, sequenced, verifiable at every node, written for someone who needed to act quickly on the basis of what they were reading. He sent it simultaneously to Adriana's personal email, to the Securities and Exchange Commission's whistleblower portal, and to 6 of the 9 board members whose contact information was publicly listed in the company's regulatory filings. Then he took out his phone and called the Mumbai Consortium's lead partner directly. The number had been in a briefing document that had passed through Adriana's calls on a day when Solomon had been parked outside an office building in Palo Alto with nothing to do but listen and remember. He introduced himself by name and role and said, "The security breach your team identified this morning was fabricated. I have documentation showing how and by whom. I am sending it to you now. Do not act on the breach finding before your technical team has verified what I'm showing you. Every piece of evidence is independently auditable. You do not need to take my word for anything." Silence on the line. "Then, who are you exactly?" "Someone who has been watching this deal from the front seat for 2 years and 9 months, Solomon said, "and who would very much like to see it close." He heard typing. He waited. The Mumbai partner's head of IT security was evidently both fast and thorough, because the silence lasted 4 minutes and 40 seconds before the partner came back on the line and said, very quietly, "The provisioning date on that server. Our team missed it completely. We assumed it was existing infrastructure. It was created 3 weeks ago specifically to generate this evidence," Solomon said. "The data transfer never left Voss Capital's network. Your proprietary information is intact." Another pause. "Then I need to speak to Miss Voss directly. She'll call you within the hour," Solomon said. "I'll make sure of it." He was still sitting in the waiting area when Adriana came back down the corridor, and the expression on her face as she rounded the corner and saw him calmly typing was the expression of a person who has been fighting for something in the wrong room and has just discovered the actual room was somewhere else entirely. He told her what he had found. He told her in the organized, sequenced way his father had. Taught him to present information to people who needed to act on it. No more detail than necessary, no less than sufficient. He watched her face move through disbelief and then recognition, and then the cold anger of someone who has identified the specific source of a harm she had not understood until now. She called the Mumbai partner within 6 minutes. The call lasted 31 minutes. By the end of it, the meeting had been rescheduled, not cancelled, rescheduled. The Tokyo and Lagos partners followed within 90 minutes, because when the Mumbai Consortium communicated that the security breach had been demonstrated as fabricated and that the negotiation was proceeding, the domino fell in the direction of continuation rather than collapse. There was still repairing to do, still trust to rebuild, still the communication damage of 3 years that would need to be addressed in the room Solomon had told Adriana he could help navigate. But the deal was alive. The 4 hours had become a 2-week extension, and the extension was workable. Solomon finished Mrs. Okonkwo's asylum documentation at 2:15 the following morning. He submitted it to the federal court in Oakland with 11 hours remaining on the deadline. He made one translation error along the way, caught it himself at the second read, corrected it before it compounded. He sat with his coffee going cold on the kitchen table for 5 minutes. After he submitted it, not because he needed to rest, but because he needed to acknowledge to himself what had just been prevented and what had been completed, and that both things mattered equally, regardless of the dollars attached to one and not the other. Conrad Voss was removed from the board within 9 days of Solomon's documentation reaching its recipients. The SEC opened a formal investigation. 2 additional board members, who had been aware of Conrad's activities without acting on them, resigned quietly within the week. The company's general counsel sent Solomon a formal letter of appreciation that carefully avoided any language that could be construed as admission of institutional failure, which Solomon read once and filed in the same folder as things that said less than they meant. The Nakamura-Obi Prasad merger closed 6 weeks later. Solomon was present for 2 of the final negotiating sessions, not as a driver and not as a contractor, but as a formally engaged cultural communications consultant whose work was documented in the Partnership Agreement's implementation framework. The Tokyo partners' closing remarks referenced specifically the quality of cultural representation in the final phase of negotiations as evidence of Voss Capital's seriousness about long-term partnership rather than transactional acquisition. It was the most expensive compliment Solomon had ever received, and he received it with the same composure he had brought to every room he had ever sat in, which was the composure of someone who had always known what he was worth and had simply been waiting for the conditions that allowed it to be useful. Adriana Voss called him 3 weeks after the closing. She was sitting in her office on the 19th floor. She was direct, as she always was, which was a quality Solomon had genuinely respected, even when it was directed past him rather than at him. She told him the board wanted to offer him a position, Director of International Relations and Cultural Strategy. Salary in the high 6 figures, benefits, equity, an office with a view. Solomon was at his kitchen table finishing a translation project for a non-profit legal clinic in Oakland. He asked for 48 hours to think about it. In those 48 hours, he went to see his mother, who lived in a house in Detroit he had found for her 2 years after his father died, a small place with a porch and a yard and good light in the mornings. Ruth James was 71 years old and had a cough she'd been dismissing for 8 months, that her doctor had told her needed proper evaluation, and that she'd been deferring because the evaluation cost money, and she'd been protecting Solomon's stress levels with the same instinct she'd applied to protecting his childhood. He sat with her on the porch and told her about the job. She asked him what he was going to do. He said he thought he was going to take it. She said, "What does taking it require from you that you haven't already given?" He thought about that for a long time. Then he said, "It requires me to ask for something before I say yes." She nodded. She poured more coffee. She said, "Then ask." He called Adriana the next morning and told her he would accept the position under 2 conditions. The first was a comprehensive capability audit of every administrative and support staff role in the company, a formal process for identifying skills, languages, and expertise that were not captured in job descriptions or being utilized in current roles, and a mechanism to compensate and promote accordingly. The second was a restructured hiring process across all departments that evaluated demonstrated capability over credentialed presentation, that stopped treating resume gaps as disqualifying and started treating them as data points requiring understanding rather than assumptions. Adriana was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I expected you to ask for something. I didn't expect you to ask for something for other people." Solomon said, "I am asking for myself too. I want to work in a system that doesn't require another crisis to reveal the next person sitting in the front seat. Because there's always another person in the front seat. And they shouldn't have to wait for the deal to start dying to get the chance to say what they know. Both conditions were approved by the board within 2 weeks. The capability audit, conducted over 3 months by an independent HR consulting firm, returned results that were by turns remarkable and quietly devastating. Across the company's administrative and support infrastructure, 47% of staff held skills, languages, or professional credentials that were absent from their employment documentation and unutilized in their current roles. 12 spoke languages relevant to the company's international portfolio. 9 held advanced degrees in fields directly applicable to the company's operations. 2 had professional backgrounds that, had they been known, would have positioned them for roles 2 and 3 levels above their current placement years earlier. The process for addressing this was not quick and was not simple and generated institutional resistance from managers who were uncomfortable with the implication that they had been managing people without knowing who they were. But Adriana drove it with the same focused energy she applied to every negotiation, and Solomon provided the framework for implementing it with the same precision he'd applied to every translation. And by the end of the first year, the company's internal mobility had increased by 31%, and 2 employees had been promoted into roles that made direct use of capabilities that had been sitting invisible and unused from the day they were hired. Mrs. Okonkwo's asylum appeal was approved 4 months after Solomon submitted the documentation. She received the letter on a Tuesday morning and called him from the parking lot of her daughter's school because she'd been dropping them off when the notification arrived, and she couldn't wait until she was somewhere quieter to share it. Her daughter started school in Oakland the following September. The 7-year-old had recently decided she wanted to be an engineer. The 10-year-old was already planning to study law. Solomon kept the drawing of the house with the garden on his desk at the office on the 19th floor of the Voss Capitol building, framed now, placed where he could see it from his chair. His mother had her diagnostic work done in October of the following year. The cough, addressed before it became something it would have been harder to address, was resolved by November. She called him when the final results came back and said, "I told you it would be fine." He said, "You also told me to ask for what I needed." She said, "I know, and I'm very proud of you for both of those things." He moved in the spring. Larger apartment, quieter street, actual windows facing east, so that the first thing he saw every morning was light, rather than the parking structure wall that had been the view from his studio for 3 years. He transferred the notebook from the glove compartment to his desk at home, placed it next to the notebook he'd started filling in his new role, and understood in that moment that the version of the story that looked like waiting had actually been preparation, and that the version that looked like silence had actually been observation, and that the version that looked like invisibility had actually been the accumulation of exactly the knowledge that the moment required. He still drove sometimes, not for the company. On weekends, occasionally, for a car service he stayed affiliated with because he liked the particular quality of thinking that happened in the front seat, the way the city moved past at that specific speed, the way overheard conversations maintained the texture of something real because they weren't performing for him, because he was still, after everything, someone who could sit in a room and hear what was actually being said rather than what people were trying to say. He would think on those drives about his father at the kitchen table, about the Haitian family's letter, about what it meant to translate not just words, but the invisible structure inside which Words meant something specific to specific people in specific contexts, and how that skill had existed in him, fully formed and fully irrelevant, for 2 years and 9 months of driving Adriana. Was to the conversations it could have improved, and what the gap between capability and invitation had cost her and cost him, and cost the people on the other side of those calls who had been trying to communicate something important and had been met with something that was technically correct and substantively wrong. He thought about what it would have taken for her to ask, not much, a question, a single question at the beginning. Who are you actually, and what do you know? The answer would have saved them both years. The failure to ask had cost them both something they couldn't fully calculate. And it had cost, invisibly, the partners on the other end of calls that were failing. Not because the business rationale was wrong, but because the human communication carrying it was broken in ways nobody in the building had been paying attention to. Because the person paying attention was in the front seat and had not been invited to speak. He had been ready. He had always been ready. Readiness without invitation is not failure, but it is waste. And waste, at that scale, is the thing organizations should be most afraid of, far more afraid of than the cost of asking a question they have been too comfortable to think was necessary. Because here is what Solomon James understood from the front seat, and what every leader needs to understand before the deal starts dying at 8:47 in the morning. The people who support your work are not the backdrop of your success. They are complete professionals with complete histories and complete capabilities, the vast majority of which you have never discovered because you have never created the conditions for discovery. The driver may be the most qualified interpreter in the region. The administrative coordinator may hold the advanced degree that the problem you're stuck on requires. The person whose job description says one thing may be the exact answer to the question you haven't thought to ask them yet. This is not a remarkable exception. Solomon James's audit found it was 47% of the company. 47% of the people whose names you pass in the corridor without asking who they are. The cost of this is not just the talent you don't use, though it is that, and it is massive. It is also the problems that don't get solved because you've defined the category of who solves them too narrowly. It is the deals that collapse at 8:47 because the person who could have saved them is sitting 10 feet away in the front seat and you have never once asked what they know. Solomon James carried 7 languages and a State Department career and 2 years and 9 months of observed mistakes that could have been corrected for the entire time he worked for you. He was not difficult to find. He was not hidden. He was in the front seat. He answered when you spoke his name. He was simply never asked the question that mattered. Ask. Ask who the people around you actually are. What they've done, what they know, what they can see from where they sit that you can't see from where you stand. Ask before the deal starts dying. Ask before the crisis arrives and makes the question unavoidable. Ask because the answer is worth more than the assumption. Ask because somewhere in the infrastructure of your organization, there is a person with a notebook in a glove compartment full of the exact observations you need, who has been waiting, not passively, but with purpose, for the invitation to speak. Don't make them wait for the 11th call. That one is always almost too late. This story is a fictional dramatization inspired by the daily reality of extraordinary expertise sitting invisible inside ordinary seeming roles, and by the systems that measure human beings by their containers rather than their contents. In a world that reads credentials before it reads people, choose to ask the question that credential review never asks: Who are you actually, and what do you know? The answer might be the $1.2 billion you almost lost. The answer might be everything.